In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to solve quadratic equations. And there are several methods for solving quadratic equations. The very first one is the method of factoring. And this is a method that is not exclusive to quadratic equations. It actually can be used to solve equations of higher degree other than 2. So you can use it to solve cubic equations and quartic equations, quintic equations. So as long as you are able to factor the polynomial associated to the equation, you can apply this method to solve the equation. So it is a method that is not exclusive to quadratic equations. And the method is based on the following property called the zero product property. That basically says that if you have any two numbers, it doesn't matter whether they're real or complex. If you have any two numbers and when you multiply them, you get 0, so the product of those two numbers equals 0, then that means that at least one of those two numbers is 0. So if P times Q equals 0, then it has to be the case that either P is 0 or Q is 0, or maybe both are 0. But that's the only way in which the product of two numbers could be equal to 0, if at least one of them is equal to 0. So based on that property, then we can come up with this method for solving equations. The method of solving equations by factoring. And here are the steps for this method. Step 1, you're going to move everything on your equation to one side. You want everything moved over to one side. And you're going to simplify that side. So move everything to one side and simplify that. I usually move everything to the left side. I like having the other side, the right-hand side, to be equal to 0. So you have to move everything to one side of the equation and simplify it, and then you have to have 0 on the other side. So that would be step 1. Step 2, once you have everything on one side of the equation simplified, you're going to factor as much as possible. And please remember that you should always start by factoring out the GCF when factoring. All right, and then the last step is once you have factored as much as possible, you're going to set each of the non-constant factors equal to 0, and you're going to solve each of the resulting equations. And once you do that, you're done. You solved the equation. Okay, so let's do a few examples. So first one says you have to solve this. 2x times parentheses x plus 1 close parentheses equals 0. Okay, so the very first step that you want is you want to move everything to one side so that you have 0 on the other one. And in this case, everything is moved already to the left and I have 0 on the right hand side. So step 1 is done. Okay, for this one is already done for you. Step 2 is factor as much as possible, factoring out the GCF. Note that this is already factored. So that means for this example, step 2 is also already done for you. And the last step, once you have factored everything, you're going to set each of the non-constant factors equal to 0. So I have two factors here. 2x is one factor and the x plus 1 is the other factor. So we have that and that. So those are the two factors. So you're going to take each of those factors and set them equal to 0. So 2x equals 0, or x plus 1 could be 0. Okay? And then you're going to solve each of these equations. So solving this one, just divide by 2 both sides. That gives me x equals 0. And then subtracting 1 from both sides here, that gives us x equals -1. And those are the solutions of this equation. equation. So x equals 0 or x equals -1. Okay? And I'm going to divide this. I'm going to draw a line here to separate the problems. Okay. Next one. It is this one, B. X squared plus x minus 12 equals 0. Okay, 3 steps again. First step is move everything to one side of the equation so that you have 0 on the other side. Here, everything has already been moved to the left and I have 0 on the right. So step 1 is actually already done for you in this example. The next step would be to factor as much as possible. Okay, so then you take a moment and you factor that. And this factors as x plus 4, x minus 3. Okay. The GCF here was 1, so by the way, but you should always check for that. And then, so step 2 is done. Once you have factored as much as possible, you set each of the factors equal to 0. So I'm going to set x plus 4 equal to 0, or, and then set to the other one equal to 0, or x minus 3 equals 0. And then you're going to solve each of these equations, and you get the solution. So subtract 4 from both sides here, you get x equals -4. And add 3 on both sides here, you're going to get x equals 3. So those are the two solutions for this equation. All right. Okay, let me divide again this by drawing a line. Okay, next one. Let's do C. X times x plus 2 equals -1. Okay, the first step is I want to move everything to one side, so I have 0 on the other one, and I'm supposed to simplify. So, but here, I need to undo this multiplication here, because I'm going to need that in order to simplify and then factor. This is, you don't want that, okay? You want to undo this, and then also move the -1 to the left, because I want everything on one side, I want 0 on the other one. So we should undo this, so we're going to distribute here. You're going to get here x squared, so distribute, plus 2x equals -1. Okay, distribute, you get that, and then I'm going to move the plus the 1 to here, and it's going to become plus 1. So this is going to become x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 0. And that completes step 1. I have moved everything to one side, I have 0 on the other one, and I have simplified. The next step is going to be, you're going to factor as much as possible. Start by the GCF. The GCF here is 1, so just need to factor. This factors as x plus 1 equals 0. And then you're going to set each of the factors equal to 0. X plus 1 equals 0, or x plus 1 equals 0. And then you're going to solve. Note that these two equations actually give you exactly the same thing. So solving one of them is enough. They give you the same thing. So solving this one, you get x equals -1. So you get x equals 1 is the only solution. Sometimes when the solution is repeated, we want to know how many times it is repeated. So sometimes we say, we report that by saying the solution is x equals -1 with multiplicity 2. Multiplicity equals 2. That means it is repeat it 2 times because both equations give us exactly the same thing. So if we have solved both, we would have gotten -1 twice. Okay? All right. Now let's solve the next one. You should, at some point, we only have 3 more examples left. At some point, you should stop the video and attempt at least one of these. I suggest that you attempt the very last one, F. Okay? All right. Let's do D. D. First step is move everything to one side because you need 0 on the other side. So if you move the x to the left hand side, so move that x over there to the left, you're going to get x cubed minus x equals 0. So that completes step 1. After that, you're going to factor. Factoring this, well, the GCF is actually x because x is repeated in both terms. So x can be factored out, and then you would get x squared minus 1 equals 0. Now, this, you have to keep, remember, you have to keep factoring. You have to factor as much as possible. You have to keep factoring. So this, I'm going to factor. That's the difference of squares. And this is x minus 1, x plus 1 equals 0. And then, once you have factored as much as possible, you're going to take each of the factors and set them equal to 0. There's 3 factors here. There's 3 things we multiplied, x, x minus 1, and x plus 1. So each of them, set them equal to 0. The first one, x equals 0. The second one would be x minus 1, set it equal to 0. And then in the third one, x plus 1, set it equal to 0. And then you're going to solve each of these. The first one is already done. There's really nothing to do here. Then solving the middle one is going to give me x equals 1. And solving this one gives us x equals -1. All right, so we have 3 solutions for this one. We got 3 solutions. And that is over. Okay, now let's tackle this one. If you would like, pause the video and give it a try. The first step is already done. The first step is move everything to one side so you have 0 on the other side. So that one is already done. So you would only have to complete steps 2 and 3. Okay, step 2 is factor this. GCF is x. So factor now the x, you're going to get x squared minus 6x minus 40 equals 0. And then you're going to factor that. Take your time and factor it. This actually factors as, let's see, 4 and 10. So x minus 10, x plus 4 equals 0. And then once you have factored, set each of the factors equal to 0. So that means x equals 0, or x minus 10 equals 0, or x plus 4 equals 0, and then solve each of these. The very first one, it's already done, so that's one solution. The next one, adding plus 10 on both sides, that gives us x equals 10. And the third one gives us x equals -4. So again, this one had 3 solutions. All right, and now let's do the very last one. For the very last one, you have 4 terms, so you have to remember how to factor a polynomial with 4 terms. You have to do grouping here in order to factor. But first of all, remember that first step is move everything to one side so you have equals 0 on the other side, and that's already done. The second step would be to factor. The GCF here is 1. There's 1 and 2 have nothing in common, and the x is not repeated throughout. So GCF is 1. After that, you factor by grouping. So you take the first two, factor the GCF, and then factor the next two. The first two have x squared in common, so x squared. And then you're going to get x plus 2 here. And then these two have the negative 1 in common, so pull out a negative 1 or just a minus. I'm going to write negative 1. And then here you would have x plus 2. All right. Then x plus 2 is repeated, so it's a common factor. So then factor it out. Factor that out, you're going to get x plus 2, x squared minus 1 equals 0. And then we're going to keep factoring because now these factors are more. That's the difference of squares. So this is then x minus 1, x plus 1 equals 0. And then set each of these factors equal to 0. X plus 2 equals 0. X minus 1 equals 0. X plus 1 equals 0. And now we're going to solve each of these equations, 3 equations, and we're going to get the solutions. So solving the first one gives us x equals negative 2. The next one gives us x equals 1. And the last one gives us x equals negative 1. So that's how you solve polynomial equations or quadratic equations by the method of factoring. Follow those 3 steps. Move everything to one side so you have 0 on the other side. Simplify. Factor as much as possible, remembering to start factoring by first looking for the GCF and factor out the GCF. And lastly, step 3 is set each of these factors, set each of the non-constant factors equal to 0, and then solve each of the equations and find x that way.